He told her, before the ink of the register had so much as dried, that she was to keep to the east wing and he to the west, and that between them there need be nothing warmer than civility. Hester Fairfax stood in the frost-white hall of Heramir with her one trunk, her father's old medicine case, and the new gold band already loosening on a finger, grown thin from a lean autumn. And she did not flinch, because she had promised herself on the coach ride north that she would not give this house the satisfaction of watching her flinch. She would remember this hour longest afterward, not the wedding itself, which had been 11 minutes and a borrowed ring, but this, the Earl of Heramir standing at the foot of his own staircase, telling his bride the terms of her captivity as though he were reading her a weather report. "It is a bargain, Miss Fairfax," he said, "nothing more. I keep to my own wing. You'll not be troubled by me." She had not yet learned that a man could mean a sentence like that as a mercy rather than an insult, and so she took it, that first evening, exactly as it was meant to wound, though it was not, in fact, meant to wound at all, and she would spend the better part of a winter discovering the difference. Julian Vane was tall in the particular way of men who have stopped noticing their own height, dark-haired, dark-eyed, with a stillness to him that the servants called grief and the county called pride, and hands too roughened for a man who owned 4,000 acres and had never in his life had to lift a scythe. He did not raise his voice. He had never needed to. Behind him, in the shadow of the stair, an older woman in gray had watched the exchange, with her hands folded at her waist and something unreadable moving behind her eyes. And though Hester did not yet know her name, she would come to know that gray-clad stillness better than she knew her own reflection before the winter was through. The bargain itself was plain enough, and plainly stated, twice over, in the solicitor's chambers a fortnight before. The old Earl's will required that Julian stand married, sound in body, and master of Heramir entire upon the stroke of midnight on 12th night of the year he completed 30 years, or the whole estate, house, land, title, and trust would pass to his nephew Peter, a boy of 9, under the guardianship of the boy's mother until his majority. Julian had 31 weeks to be married when he made the offer to a woman he had met exactly once across a ledger book she had balanced for his late aunt in a fortnight when no one else in 3 counties could make the numbers agree. He had not offered her affection. He had offered her a name, a roof, and freedom from an uncle who meant to sell her to his own creditor before Michaelmas, and she had taken it the way a drowning woman takes a rope, without asking whether the hand that threw it was warm. "Do you understand me?" he had asked that last afternoon in the solicitor's chambers, and she had said, "I understand a bargain, my lord. I have kept books for men who thought themselves subtle about worse ones." Something had moved in his face then, not quite a smile, more the ghost of the idea of one, and he had said, "You will find me the least subtle man in England, Miss Fairfax." I say what I mean. It was, she would learn, the only lie he told her in the whole of that first season, though he did not know it was a lie when he said it. Now, in the hall, with the trunk still unopened and the gray-clad woman still watching from the stair, Hester inclined her head exactly as far as courtesy required, and not 1 degree further. "As you wish, my lord," she said. "I did not come for company." "You came for a roof," he said, "and I have one to spare. Half of it, in fact, entirely idle." He gestured toward the west stair with 2 fingers, the gesture of a man dismissing a business matter rather than a wife, and turned to go. And it was only as his boots struck the second step that she saw him check, briefly, as though some word had caught in his throat and been swallowed before it reached his mouth. The first hairline crack in a wall she had not yet learned was worth watching for. Cracks. The gray-clad woman came forward then and introduced herself as Cordelia Rain, sister to the first countess, dead these 2 years and more, and said, in a voice pitched soft as lavender water, that she kept the still room and the household books and would be glad to hand the latter over to a woman with a reputation for figures, since grief made a man careless with his own accounts. And someone must watch them for him. She said it kindly. She said everything kindly. It would be a long while before Hester understood that kindness, in that house, was not always evidence of a kind heart, and longer still before she understood that the woman's hand, closing just then around the small silver key at her waist, was not a gesture of ownership, but one of grief so old it had curdled into something else entirely. Outside, past the tall windows, the first snow of the year had begun, fine as flour, and somewhere above the stairs a clock Hester had not yet learned belonged to no one but the Earl himself struck 5, its chime a half-second ahead of true, as though impatient with time. She had 31 weeks. She did not yet know why the number mattered, only that it had been said twice, gravely, by 2 different men, and that a fact repeated twice in a solicitor's chambers was a fact worth keeping, the way her father had taught her to keep every figure that did not balance on the first pass. She climbed the east stair alone, her trunk carried by a boy who would not meet her eye and did not look back at the west wing, though she would think, far too often in the weeks that followed, about the light that burned late behind its shuttered windows, and about a man who had married her for nothing warmer than convenience, and yet had checked, on the second stair, as though something in him had wanted to say otherwise. She learned the shape of Heramir the way she had always learned any ledger too large to read at a glance, by columns, by small totals, by trusting that the sum would eventually explain itself. The house had 48 rooms and used perhaps a dozen, a chapel gone to dust, a library with no fire laid in it though the grate was swept daily, which struck her as a curious kind of tending. Care spent on absence. She met the housekeeper on her second morning, a broad, gray, blunt-spoken woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who looked her over once, top to toe, the way a farmer looks over a horse he has been told is sound, and said, "Well, you've a straight back, at least, which is more than the last one had." "What last one?" Hester asked. "There was no last one," said Mrs. Pruitt, wiping her hands on her apron, though they were already dry, which was her habit before saying anything she considered worth the saying. "His lordship's never brought a wife up that stair before you, madam, bargain or no bargain, and I'll tell you plain, since no one else in this house troubles themselves to be plain, you'll do better here minding your own ledgers than minding his moods. He keeps his own counsel the way this house keeps its snow, close and cold and longer than you'd credit." Hester found she liked her immediately, the way one likes a door that at least announces when it is locked. "Do you know why he keeps to his wing?" she asked, and Mrs. Pruitt's face did something complicated, a door shutting behind a door. "That," she said, "is his lordship's account to render, not mine, and if you take my counsel, you'll not ask him outright, not yet. Men like him don't answer questions, they answer patience." It was, Hester thought, the truest thing anyone in the house had said to her, and she filed it the way she filed a discrepancy she could not yet explain, not forgotten, only set aside, awaiting its proof. Her first real conversation with her husband came 4 days later, over the household accounts themselves, which Cordelia had indeed surrendered to her with a smile so warm it left no mark of reluctance anywhere upon it. Hester had found, in the 3rd week's column, a figure that did not balance, a purchase from the village apothecary, recorded only as sundries, 6 shillings. No more detail than that, appearing with a regularity she found almost musical, once a fortnight, precise as a heartbeat. She brought the book to the library, where she had learned he sat most evenings among the unlit grate, and found him there turning the gears of a small clock in his palm, not reading, not writing, simply turning them, over and over, the way another man might turn a coin. "My lord," she said, "there is an entry I cannot account for." He did not look up at once. "Then account for the ones you can," he said, "and leave the rest to me." "I keep no secrets from my own household books, my lord, only from myself, apparently, since I am asked to balance a column I am not permitted to understand." That earned her a look, direct and considering, the first he had given her since the wedding. "You are very bold, Miss Fairfax, for a woman who agreed to a bargain of silence." "I agreed to a bargain of separate wings," she said. "No one mentioned silence. I supposed it was implied." "It was not," he said, and something in his mouth moved that was almost, the shadow of the thing he had not quite smiled the day of the solicitor's chambers. "The sundries are a private matter," he said. "A physic for sleeping. My aunt kept the accounting of it before you came, and Mrs. Rain keeps it now, in the particulars, though the sum passes through your book because every sum in this house passes through your book. That is the nature of the position." "Then you do not sleep well," she said. Not a question, though it functioned as one, and he set the clock's gears down on the arm of the chair with a small, final click. "I sleep as well as any man sleeps who buried his wife and his son in the same week 2 winters past," he said. And there was no self-pity in it at all, only fact, laid down as flat as a coin on a counter, and it was the first time she understood that his stillness was not coldness, but a wall built very carefully, brick by brick, around a room he did not intend to let anyone else stand in. "I am sorry," she said, and meant it, and he inclined his head an inch, accepting the sorrow the way he accepted most things offered him, without comment, and turned the small clock over once more in his hand. "It is an old habit," he said, unprompted, of a man who lay for a fortnight afterward unable to keep still, and found that if his hands were occupied, his mind consented to be occupied also. "You may think it strange. I think it useful," she said, which was true, and which surprised her rather more than it seemed to surprise him. "My father kept his own hands occupied with a mortar and pestle, most evenings, long after there was any physic left to grind. Grief wants a task, or it eats the room whole." Something in his face eased then, fractionally, the way ice eases before it breaks, not yet water, but no longer only ice, and he said, "Your father was an apothecary." "He was," she said. "He taught me dosage before he taught me my letters, and left me the case and precious little else, which is why I keep other men's books for my bread." "I am aware," he said. "It is in the settlement, and in every recommendation your uncle's creditors were only too glad to give, hoping I'd take you off their hands cheap." He said it without cruelty, merely as another fact laid flat, and she found, oddly, that she preferred his facts to most men's flattery. "I am not cheap, my lord," she said. "I merely came cheaply packaged." "That," he said, and this time the almost smile arrived in full, brief as a struck match, and gone as quickly, "is the truest thing anyone has said to me in this house in 2 years." Outside, the snow had thickened against the library glass, and somewhere below in the still room a door opened and closed, soft-footed, and neither of them remarked on it, though Hester would remember, much later, that it was that same evening the Sundries column first troubled her enough to copy the dates into her own private book. Against a day when the sum might need explaining to someone other than herself. Cordelia Rain came to call on her properly 3 days after that, in the small parlor that caught the morning light, bearing a tray of the lavender cordial she brewed herself, and a manner so gently solicitous that it took Hester the better part of the visit to notice she had been asked, in the space of 20 minutes, 4 separate questions disguised as pleasantries. Each one aimed with the accuracy of a bowman at the exact seam where the marriage's bargain nature might be showing. "You must find it strange," Cordelia said, pouring, her rings catching the light, a marriage with so little warmth in its beginning. "I find it restful," Hester said, which was not entirely a lie. "Restful," Cordelia repeated and smiled the smile of a woman filing the word away for later use. "He was not always so still, you know. My sister used to say he laughed loudest of any man in the county. Before, Hester said. Before, Cordelia agreed and did not finish the sentence, which was, Hester would come to understand her particular gift. The sentence left open like a door so that whoever heard it would walk through and furnish the rest themselves, usually with something worse than the truth. "He does not raise his voice," Cordelia went on, "but you will find, in this house, that the gentlest voices are not always the safest ones to trust," and smiled again, and touched the small silver key at her waist as she said it. An unconscious gesture Hester was already beginning to catalog the way she cataloged a column that would not balance. "I find I trust figures more than voices, gentle or otherwise," Hester said, and Cordelia's smile did not so much as flicker, though something behind her eyes recalculated. "How sensible," she said. "Peter will like you, I think. He likes anyone who does not fuss over him, and God knows this house is full of people determined to fuss over what is not theirs to fuss over." She rose to go, gathering her shawl with the unhurried grace of a woman who had never in her life been made to hurry for anyone, and paused at the door. "A word of caution, freely given," she said, her voice dropping to something almost tender. "His lordship keeps his own hours and his own counsel, and a wife who goes looking for the whole of a man's grief all at once generally finds more of it than she can carry. Better to take it in small sums, the way you'd have your father's patients take a physic, a little and often, and never on an empty understanding." It was, Hester reflected afterward, very good advice, delivered by a woman she was already certain did not intend her a single ounce of good, and she filed that contradiction away too. Beside the sundries column, beside the unlit library grate, beside the checked step on the second stair, 3 small entries in a ledger whose sum she could not yet see. Though she was beginning, in the private way of a woman trained since girlhood to trust the numbers over the noise, to suspect it would not balance kindly. That night, the first true snow of the season came down in earnest, and from her window in the east wing she watched it bury the drive, the yew hedges, the sundial in the frozen garden, until the whole world outside Heramir had gone soft and white and silent. And somewhere below, faint through 2 floors and 100 feet of stone, she heard the small clockwork chime of the library clock strike midnight a half-second ahead of true. Impatient as ever, counting down, though she did not yet know toward what, the 31 weeks that had already, without her quite noticing, become 30. The thaw between them, when it came slowly, and it came over work rather than words, which suited them both. She took to sitting in the library of an evening with her ledgers while he sat with his clocks, and for the better part of a fortnight neither of them said much beyond the necessary courtesies, and she found she did not mind it. The companionable scratch of her pen and the small precise click of his tools, a kind of duet neither of them had agreed to play, but both, apparently, were content to keep time to. It was over a broken mantel clock, its inner wheel cracked clean through, that he first laughed, not the ghost of a smile this time, but an actual, startled bark of laughter, quickly smothered, when she suggested, quite seriously, that the wheel might be repaired with a strip cut from an old shilling, since her father had mended a set of apothecary scales the same way when the war made good metal scarce. "You are proposing," he said, still half laughing, that I deface the king's coin to mend my grandfather's clock. I am proposing that your grandfather's clock will not care whose face is on the metal so long as it keeps time," she said. And he laughed again, shorter this time, but real. And something in the room shifted, the way a held breath shifts when it is finally let go. Mrs. Pruitt, arriving with the tea tray at that exact moment, stopped dead in the doorway and stared at the pair of them with an expression of such open astonishment that Hester nearly laughed herself. "I don't believe," said Mrs. Pruitt slowly, setting down the tray as though it might startle something, "that I have heard that sound in this room in 2 winters. His lordship glanced up, and for just a moment the wall he had built so carefully showed a gap in it, small as a keyhole, and Hester saw straight through to whatever grieving thing lived behind it before he composed himself again. "It is only a clock, Mrs. Pruitt," he said. "It is only a great many things, until it isn't," said Mrs. Pruitt, and took herself off, and Hester filed the moment away too, marked in her private ledger not with ink but with something warmer, though she could not yet have named what. It was that same week he gave her the watch. Not a gift, precisely. He was careful to say it was not a gift, handing it across the space between their 2 chairs, with the brisk, faintly embarrassed manner of a man settling a debt, rather than offering a token, but a watch nonetheless. His father's, small and silver and worn smooth at the case from 3 generations of thumbs, "so that you'll know when to expect me at table, and when not to," he said, "which is a courtesy owed any wife, bargain or no." She turned it over once in her palm before she opened it, feeling the smoothness of the metal, the faint warmth it had taken from his hand. "There is an inscription," he said, before she could find it herself, as though bracing her, inside the case. "My father had it engraved before he died, some sentiment about time he was fond of repeating. I have never much cared for it." She opened the case and read, in small worn letters, "Time enough for what matters," and looked up at him and found him watching her with an expression he did not quite manage to keep guarded. "My father believed it," he said. "I have found less occasion to." "Perhaps that will change," she said, before she could think better of saying it, and he did not answer, only took up his clock gears again and turned them, over and over, though she noticed his hands were not quite steady doing it, and she thought, not for the first time, that a man who kept himself this carefully shut was not a cold man at all, only a frightened one, and she found she wanted very badly to know what it was he was afraid of. She did not ask that night. Mrs. Pruitt's counsel held patience, not questions. But she began to watch him the way she watched a column that would not balance, gathering small sums toward a total she could feel coming without yet being able to name it, the way he never took his evening cordial from any hand but Cordelia's own, the way his color had grown, these past weeks, a little grayer of a morning, a little slower to rise from his chair, the way once. Crossing the gallery late, she had heard through his door a sound like a man fighting for breath, and had stood with her hand on the latch for the length of 10 heartbeats before some old instinct, her father's instinct, dosage before letters, told her not yet to knock, only to note the hour and the date, and set it down beside the Sunrise column in the private book she was keeping now, without. Entirely admitting to herself why. The blow, when it fell at the 12th night preparations already 6 weeks underway. In the small hours after a supper at which Julian had eaten almost nothing and risen from the table twice, gray about the mouth, waving off concern with a hand that shook only slightly, only enough for Hester to see it, and for no one else, apparently, to be looking. She found Cordelia in the still room near midnight, measuring drops from a dark bottle into the silver cup that went up each night on the same tray, at the same hour, by the same hand, and something in the ordinary domestic scene stopped Hester in the doorway with a coldness that had nothing to do with the season. "How is his lordship's cordial measured?" she asked, as evenly as she could manage. And Cordelia did not look up from the drops, her hand perfectly steady. 12, she said, exactly 12, as my sister always measured it, God rest her, and before her, my mother, for every nervous complaint in this family since before either of us was born. It has never once varied. It has never once helped, either, from what I can see of him, Hester said, and Cordelia's hand paused. Only a heartbeat, over the cup. Grief is not cured by physic, Mrs. Vane, she said, using the name with a faint, deliberate emphasis as though testing how it sat on her tongue. It is only endured. I have endured a great deal more of his than you have had time to. That may be so, Hester said, and left it there, because she had learned enough in a life spent balancing other men's books to know that a woman who shows her whole hand before she is ready to play it has already lost the game. But she did not sleep that night, and in the gray hour before dawn, she went down to the still room alone, with a candle and her father's small steel probe, and began, one by one, in the particular patient silence of a woman who has spent her whole life reconciling figures that refused at first to agree, to smell, and taste. The barest grain of each against her tongue, the way her father had taught her long before he taught her Latin, and found, in the third bottle from the left, beneath the bitter familiar note of valerian and hops, something else entirely. A green, faintly metallic sweetness, she knew, with the sick lurch of recognition from a chapter of her father's own hand-copied physic book titled, in his careful script, of the foxglove and its dangers in excess. She sat very still on the still-room stool a long moment, the candle guttering, doing the arithmetic her father had drilled into her before he taught her anything else, a little and often, and never on an empty understanding, Cordelia's own words come back to mock her, and understood. With the particular cold clarity of a sum finally balancing, that someone had been measuring 12 drops of foxglove into an earl's nightly cordial for weeks, perhaps months, in quantities too small to kill outright but exactly large enough, compounded night on night, to weaken a man's heart past the point of standing upright and sound of body on the stroke of midnight. 12th night, 31 weeks made now barely 6. It was not, she understood then, her husband's own melancholy killing him by inches. It was arithmetic, deliberate and patient as her own, kept in a different hand, toward a different sum, and she sat with the bottle cold in her palm and felt something in her that was not fear at all, but fury. Quiet and absolute, the kind her father had always warned her, was the most dangerous kind precisely because it did not show. She did not go to Julian that first night, though every instinct told her to. Instead, she did what her father had taught her to do with any figure too large to trust at a glance. She went back to the books. She spent 3 days at the household ledger, with a patience that cost her dearly, cross-checking the sundries column against the still room's own private accounting, which Cordelia kept in a small locked book Hester had, on the 4th night, quietly and without permission, opened with a hairpin, worked the way her father had once shown her to work a stuck apothecary drawer. What she found there did not, at first, look like proof of anything. Long, orderly columns of valerian, of hops, of chamomile, entirely respectable, entirely dull, until she noticed that the purchases of a particular tincture the village apothecary's boy delivered fortnightly, recorded modestly as digitalis, for the hounds, had increased, in small and almost invisible increments, precisely across the weeks that Julian's color had worsened, precisely across the weeks the 31 had become 30, had become 20, had become the encroaching. Unbearable 6. A ledger never lies, her father used to say. Only the hand that keeps it. And here was a hand that had kept this one very carefully indeed. Careful enough that no one without her particular training would ever have thought to hold the page to the light and notice, as she did on the third night, that beneath the modest recorded sum of 6 shillings for sundries lay the ghost of a larger figure. Scratched through and rewritten smaller, again and again a hand correcting itself toward invisibility. She copied every entry into her own private book with hands that did not shake, because she would not let them, and on the 4th morning she was summoned, before she had finished, to the small parlor, where Cordelia sat with her rings catching the light and an expression of such perfect, sorrowful gentleness that Hester understood at once she had been seen. "My dear," Cordelia said, "I am so very sorry to be the one to say this to you, but it cannot wait. His lordship has grown noticeably worse this fortnight, has he not, since your arrival? I had not thought it my place to remark on it before now, but the servants have begun to talk, and I find I cannot in conscience stay silent any longer for his sake." "Talk of what?" Hester said, very evenly, though something cold had begun climbing her spine. "Of your father's trade," Cordelia said, gently, so gently. "Of a bride who arrived penniless and skilled in dosage and physic, married for nothing warmer than a roof, into a household where the master's health has failed steadily since her coming. I do not say I believe it. I say only that others have begun to, and that it would go very ill for you in a house of witnesses should it come to a magistrate's ear before you had the chance to explain yourself." It was, Hester understood in the space of a single indrawn breath, beautifully done, her own competence, her father's trade, the very knowledge that had let her find the truth, turned back against her as the accusation itself, the poison's shadow thrown neatly across the one person capable of proving where it truly lay. "I have explained myself to no one who has not first been honest with me," Hester said, and Cordelia's smile did not move, though something behind her eyes went very still and very careful. "That is your privilege, of course," she said. "I only hope for your sake that you have kept your own accounts as carefully as you keep his lordship's, my dear, because I promise you mine are in perfect order, and have been for a great many years." The offer came 2 days later, delivered not by Cordelia herself, but by Mr. Aldridge, the family's solicitor, arrived early for the 12th night settlement, and plainly uneasy in his errand, turning his hat in his hands in the small parlor, as though it might offer him some excuse to leave before he had finished speaking. "Mrs. Rain has asked me to convey," he said, "that should the marriage prove," his voice caught delicately on the word, untenable, given the rumors now circulating below stairs, and, I am sorry to say, beyond them a settlement has been prepared. £400, a character reference of the most flattering kind, and passage arranged to wherever you might wish to begin again, quietly, before the new year, before any formal question need be raised before a magistrate. It is, if I may say so, a generous offer, madam, under the circumstances, and I would be failing my duty if I did not advise you to consider it most seriously." Hester stood at the window a long moment, watching snow fall thick and silent over the buried garden, over the sundial she had not seen bare earth around in a month, and thought of £400, and a name unstained, and a coach south before the roads closed entirely, and thought too of the small locked book copied faithfully into her own hand, and of a man 3 rooms away turning clock gears between fingers that trembled now more often than they did not, and found, with a calm that surprised her, that there was no version of leaving that did not require her to leave him to die of an arithmetic only she had troubled to solve. "Tell Mrs. Rain," she said at last, "that I thank her for her generosity, and that I decline it." Mr. Aldridge blinked. "Madam," he said, "I feel I must be plain. If this matter proceeds to accusation, the appearance is not in your favor. You arrived with knowledge of physic and no fortune of your own. His lordship's health has failed under your roof. A magistrate would want very little persuading." "Then let him want it," she said, "and turn it over as long as he pleases. Because when he is done turning it over, he will find that I have never once given his lordship a cup, a spoon, or a single grain of anything with my own hand. And Mrs. Rain has given him nothing else for 2 years running. I would rather stand accused honestly than leave richly and be believed a liar for the rest of my life, sir, and I will not put my name to a settlement that buys my silence about a truth I have not finished proving." It cost her something to say it. She felt the cost of it plainly, a kind of hollowness behind the ribs. The particular ache of a woman refusing the only easy door in a house full of locked ones, and Mr. Aldridge studied her for a long moment with an expression that had shifted somewhere in her speech from pity to something closer to respect. "That is a very great risk to run, madam, on a marriage you did not choose for love." "It is a very great risk to run on a marriage I did not choose for love," she agreed, and found, saying it aloud, that it was no longer entirely true, though she was not yet ready to examine why. The darkest hour came 3 nights later, with the snow still falling and the roads to the village already impassable, when Julian collapsed at the foot of the great stair in full view of half the household, his color gone the gray of old ash, his breath coming in a shallow, terrible rhythm Hester recognized with a physician's daughter's horror as the body's own arithmetic finally failing to balance. She reached him before anyone else, on her knees on the cold stone with his head in her lap, and heard, through the roaring in her own ears, Cordelia's voice above her, pitched perfectly to carry to every servant crowding the gallery. "There," she said. "There, you see? It is exactly as I feared," and turned, with terrible gentle sorrow, to Mrs. Pruitt. "Send for the magistrate at first light, if the roads permit it. I will not have it said I did not act the moment I knew." It was, Hester understood even through her own fear, the villain's masterstroke and her own darkest hour arriving in the same breath. For now, with Julian carried insensible to his bed, and a magistrate to be sent for the instant the drifts allowed it, she was accused before witnesses, locked in effect, if not in name, to the east wing by the cold civility of servants no longer certain whom to trust, and utterly without proof that would satisfy anyone but herself, since a private book, copied by her own hand, in a house that already believed her a poisoner, would convince no one of anything but her own guilt. She sat alone that night, with her candle and her father's case and the small watch ticking a half-second ahead of true in her palm, and allowed herself, for the length of exactly one held breath, to feel the whole weight of it, the marriage that had never been a marriage, the man dying 2 floors above her of a crime she alone could see, the accusation that fit her like a coat sewn to measure. And then, because her father had taught her that grief wants a task or it eats the room whole, she rose and lit a second candle, and began, with hands that had finally, after everything, begun to shake, to write out every entry, every date, every discrepancy, in a fair clean hand meant not for herself this time, but for a witness. Because a ledger that convinces only its keeper is worth nothing at all. She was 3 pages into it when a soft knock came at her door, and Mrs. Pruitt let herself in without waiting for leave, closed the door behind her, and stood with her back against it and her hands, for once, not wiping themselves on her apron, but pressed flat together as if in prayer. "I've known that woman 30 years, madam," she said, low and urgent, "and I've held my tongue 30 years for the boy Peter's sake, Because whatever else she is, she loves that child past reason. And a woman who loves past reason will do past reason things to keep him fed and housed and titled. But I'll not hold it a day longer if it costs his lordship his life. And I think you already know more than you've said, and I think, if you'll have me, I can get you into that still room again before the magistrate ever sees the road, and I can bring you the one soul in this county who's afraid enough of her to finally tell the truth of where that foxglove came from." "Snow keeps its own counsel, madam," said Mrs. Pruitt. "Same as this house, but I find I've had enough of counsel-keeping to last me the rest of my days." And in the silence that followed, with the candle guttering and the snow still falling thick and white against the black window, Hester understood that the darkest hour, as her father had always told her every darkest hour eventually does, had just this moment begun, very quietly, to turn. They moved before dawn, while the household still slept off its shock, Mrs. Pruitt leading Hester down the servants' stair with a lantern shuttered to a thread of light and a set of keys she had, by her own cheerful admission, never in 30 years been meant to hold. The still room yielded on a second and more ruthless search. What the first had only hinted at, beneath a false board at the back of the lowest shelf, a second locked book, older and plainer than the one Hester had already copied, its pages recording, in a hand grown less careful with each entry, as though its writer's nerve had frayed along with her patience, every purchase of foxglove tincture, bought these 18 months past from a village apothecary's apprentice named Simeon, who was, Mrs. Pruitt revealed with grim satisfaction, her own sister's boy, prenticed young and easily frightened, and living not 4 miles off, snow or no snow, if a body were willing to walk it. "I'll not have him hanged for a fool's errand run under a woman's thumb," Mrs. Pruitt said, hauling on her cloak. "But I'll have him tell the truth of it before witnesses if I have to drag him there myself by his ear, as I did when he was 9 and thieving apples." It was Julian's own steward, roused and sworn briefly to secrecy, who got word by a groom on snowshoes to Mr. Aldridge, still lodged at the village inn and unable, by the storm's grace, to reach the magistrate any sooner than anyone else. A delay that had seemed, the night before, like the last cruelty in a run of cruelties, and now looked, in the gray dawn, very much like mercy in disguise. The same snow that had shut them in together, shutting the accusation out just long enough for the truth to catch up. By midday, Simeon had been brought, white-faced and shivering, not from cold alone, into the housekeeper's own parlor, and it took Hester, sitting across from him with the second ledger open on the table between them and her voice, pitched as gently as she could make it, only one question, asked plainly and without threat, to break him entirely. "Who told you to write the sum smaller than it was, Simeon?" she said. And the boy's composure, such as it had ever been, went out of him all at once like a snuffed candle, and he told her everything, the coin pressed into his palm each fortnight, the instruction to record the purchase as digitalis for the hounds, the growing quantities he had been too frightened of Mrs. Rain, and too fond of the coin, to ever once question aloud. Meanwhile, above them, Julian had woken, weak but lucid, the physic withdrawn from his cup the moment Hester had first tasted its wrongness 3 nights past, his color already, faintly, beginning to return, and it was Mrs. Pruitt who carried him the news of what had been found below stairs, watching his face change through disbelief, through fury, through a grief so old and so freshly reopened that he had to turn to the window a long moment before he could speak at all. "She was my wife's sister," he said finally, very low. "She held Marguerite's hand when she died. She held my son before either of us knew he would not live the week, and Mrs. Pruitt, who had known him since he was younger than Peter was now, said only, "Ay, my lord, and loved you enough, I think, to hate you for surviving what she couldn't save, and hated her own boy's poverty enough to want you gone before you could give this house another heir to stand ahead of him." Grief does strange arithmetic, my lord. It doesn't excuse the sum, but it explains it. By nightfall, the storm had begun, at last, to ease, and Mr. Aldridge, informed by messenger of what the day had uncovered, sent word that he would come up to the house himself at first light, with the magistrate, not to try a poisoning, but to witness, formally, before all the household and whatever kin could be gathered on such short notice, the true accounting of Heramir's still-room and Hester. Sitting once more at Julian's bedside, with the second ledger locked safe in her own trunk and the small silver watch ticking steady in her pocket, understood that the reckoning she had been quietly building, page by page, these 6 weeks past, was very nearly ready to be laid, at last, in the light. They gathered them all in the great hall the following evening, the storm broken to a thin, clean cold, and a sky gone hard and starred above the drifted park. Candles lit in every sconce, because Julian, dressed and standing though still pale, had insisted the thing be done properly, in full light, before every soul in the house who had watched him, carried gray, faced from the stair, 3 nights before. Mr. Aldridge stood as the trust's honest instrument, the magistrate at his elbow more witness now than officer, and Cordelia stood before them in her gray, composed, upright, her hand at her waist finding the small silver key out of long habit even now, even here. "I understand," she said, before anyone could accuse her of anything, "that some ugly rumor has been carried to you, sir, concerning my still-room accounts, and I will answer it gladly, because I have nothing to hide and never have." It was Hester who answered her, not with accusation, but with the second ledger, laid open on the long table under the candlelight for every eye to see. Its columns of foxglove disguised as physic for the hounds, its figures scratched through and rewritten smaller, again and again, in a hand every soul in that hall who had ever seen Cordelia's careful correspondence would recognize at a glance. "A ledger never lies," Hester said, her voice carrying clean, and even to the back of the hall, "only the hand that keeps it. And here is the hand, Mrs. Rain, in your own writing, in your own ink, correcting itself smaller every fortnight, so that no one would ever think to add the sum entire." Cordelia's composure did not break at once. She was, Hester would think later, magnificent in her refusal to break at once. But Hester turned then to Simeon, brought forward trembling between his aunt and the steward, and asked him again, before the whole hall, the one question that had broken him in the housekeeper's parlor. "Who told you to write the sum smaller than it was?" Simeon, and the boy, weeping now, said her name, plainly, 3 times over. And it was in the silence after the third that Cordelia's hand finally left the key at her waist and went instead, briefly, to her own mouth, and something in her face gave way entire. "I never meant to kill him," she said, very quietly enough that the whole hall had to lean toward her to hear it. Which was, Hester thought, the truest thing she had said in the whole of the winter. "I meant only to slow him, to buy Peter a season, a year, until he was old enough that no one could say the boy hadn't earned his place by more than his mother's scheming. I have watched my sister's husband grieve himself half to death for 2 years, and thought, God forgive me, that a little more grief, carried a little longer, would cost him less than it has cost my son to be born second in everything, always, to a man who never once had to fight for what fell into his hands at birth." She looked, in that moment, not like a villain at all, but like a tired, frightened, grieving woman who had done a terrible arithmetic and gotten the sum wrong in every particular. And Julian, watching her from across the hall with his own face carved from something Hester could not entirely read, said, at last, in a voice gone rough but steady, "You loved my wife." "I did," Cordelia said, "more than I have ever loved anything since, save my son." "Then for her sake, and for his," he said, "you will not be tried before a magistrate, nor named before the county, nor stripped of everything you have. You will have an allowance, and a small house at the edge of the estate, far enough that Peter may still know you, and near enough that he need not lose his mother entire, and you will never again set foot in this house's still room so long as either of us lives." "It is not forgiveness," he said, and something in his voice broke very slightly on the word. "I do not know if I have that in me yet, but it is mercy, and I find I would rather be a man who gives mercy he does not yet feel than one who withholds it until he does." Cordelia wept then, finally, openly, the first tears anyone in that hall had seen from her in 2 years of composed and terrible grief, and it was Mrs. Pruitt, of all people, who crossed the floor and put an arm about her shoulders, gruff and unsentimental even in kindness, muttering something about fools and foxglove that made the boy Peter, brought in at the last to see his mother led gently away, not in chains, but in comfort, finally stop his frightened crying and simply cling to her hand instead. It was very late before the hall emptied at last, the magistrate satisfied and gone, Simeon sent home to his aunt's care with a warning, and, Hester suspected, a good deal more mercy than the boy had any right to expect, and Julian and Hester left alone at last among the guttering candles, with the whole enormous silence of the house settling back down around them, like snow resettling after a wind. He found her by the cold library grate, the small watch still ticking in her pocket, and stood a moment in the doorway before he spoke, as though gathering himself for something that cost him more than the whole day's reckoning had. "You said, that first evening," he began, and stopped, and began again. "I told you it was a bargain, nothing more. I told you I would not trouble you." She turned to look at him, and found she could finish it for him, the way she had learned, this long, strange winter, to finish a great many of his unfinished sentences. "You have troubled me every day since, my lord," she said, "and I find, to my very great surprise, that I do not wish you to stop." Something in his face came fully undone then, the wall she had watched him build brick by careful brick finally, entirely, given leave to fall. "I kept to my own wing," he said, "because I believed myself already halfway to my grave, and I would not have you widowed twice over in one winter, mourning a man you had never had reason to love in the first place. It was never a punishment, Hester. It was the only mercy I knew how to give you. Keeping myself at a distance, I thought I would not live to close. It was a poor sort of mercy, my lord," she said, gently, "for a man who repairs clocks with such patience and could not spare a fortnight's patience for his own wife." "Then let me spend what patience I have left more wisely," he said, and crossed the room, and took her hand, not the watch this time, her hand itself, bare and ink stained and steady, and said, "I will not ask you to love me, Hester. I never once had the right to ask it, and I do not ask it now, bargain paid or no, deadline met or no, 12th night come or gone. I ask only that if you should ever come to it, on your own account and for no reason of mine, you would tell me, so that I might spend whatever years are left me learning to deserve it. Marry me, because you wish it," he said, low, and there was nothing left of the solicitor's cold contract in it at all. "It is the only reason I will ever again take." And Hester, who had come to Heramir for a roof and a name and nothing warmer than civility, found that the ledger of her own heart, kept as carefully and as honestly as any book she had ever balanced, had settled its accounts somewhere in the long snowbound weeks without her quite noticing the entries add themselves, and that the sum, now she looked at it plainly, was very simple indeed. "I wish it," she said. "I have wished it, I think, since a clock's broken wheel made you laugh in a room that hadn't heard laughter in 2 years, though I was too proud a bookkeeper to enter it in any column until I was certain it would balance." "It balances," he said, and kissed her then, gently, in the light of the dying fire, with the snow settled soft and final over the whole white hush of the park outside, and somewhere above them the library clock struck the hour a half-second ahead of true, impatient as ever. Though for once neither of them minded its hurry in the least. They were married again in the small chapel the following spring, quietly, with no more than a dozen souls present, and Mrs. Pruitt weeping unashamedly into a handkerchief she pretended, throughout, to have only borrowed for her nose. Peter grew that year taller and steadier than anyone had thought a fatherless, frightened boy could grow, apprenticed in time to the estate's own steward and beloved, oddly and entirely, by the Earl who might once have had every reason to resent him, and never once did. Cordelia kept her small house at the edge of the estate, and her son's visits, and in time, Hester heard, a garden she tended with a patience that looked, from a distance, almost like peace. Simeon stayed on with the village apothecary, sworn off dark bottles for good, and became, eventually, a decent and closely watched dispenser of nothing more dangerous than chamomile. Mr. Alderidge retired the following winter with a very good story he was known, ever after, to tell rather too often at dinner. And on a bright, bitter morning almost a year to the day since a letter had said nothing of separate wings, Hester Vane stood once more in the frost-white hall of Heramir, her husband's hand warm in hers, watching snow begin to fall fine as flour past the tall windows, and heard him say, low against her hair, that he kept to no wing at all now, east or west, save whichever one she happened to be standing in, and a robin, the same robin or its near cousin, that had sung all that long winter at the still-room window, took up its small clear song somewhere out past the buried garden, and Hester Vane, who had once balanced a stranger's cruelty into a column and found it, patiently, honestly, add up to mercy instead, thought that it was, after all. Exactly as her father had always told her, some debts are paid in more than coin, and this was one account she was glad, for the whole of her life after, never to see closed. If this story warmed you, the long, cold arithmetic of a marriage that began as a bargain and ended as a home, then stay a little while longer by this fire. There is a chair kept for you, and the kettle is always on. And I would love nothing more than to hear, in the comments, which line stayed with you longest, or what you would have done, standing where Hester stood, with the truth in one hand and the easy money in the other. If you'd like more evenings like this one, warm and slow and a little snowbound, consider keeping a place by the hearth and subscribing so the light's still lit when the next story comes round. Until then, sleep well and be gentle as she was, with the ones still learning how to say what they mean.